But I want to say, first of all, thank you to the Ukrainian Institute for hosting this. There's been an explosion of interest in Ukraine since the onslaught after February the 24th, and it's hard to imagine how we would have managed in London without the Ukrainian Institute as a focal point, kind of unofficial and highly effective embassy for the Ukrainian cause here. And as some of you, but perhaps not all of you, may know, the Ukrainian Institute doesn't have any money. And although it's extremely important to raise money for Ukraine, I've been raising money for ambulances. I think, Anne, you just bought some minibuses, is that right?
No, we bought pickup trucks.
Pickup trucks. So this is absolutely vital. It is also important to keep the Ukrainian Institute going. So please, if you don't donate already, start donating. If you donate already, donate more and donate regularly. Every penny is really important. And I'm very struck here by the fact we're sitting in the Swedenborgian Hall, and this is Mr. Swedenborg, who is the founder of an almost but not completely vanished religion. It made me think about how ideas that once seemed very fashionable then go semi and indeed completely permanently out of fashion. But Anne has been absolutely ahead of the trend on this. Anne is the, if you like, the anti-Swedenborg. She went to Poland in 1988 at a time when it seemed really eccentric to be going behind the Iron Curtain, because I was at the BBC at the time and had been informed by my then boss that solidarity no longer existed and that we were to stop putting this man called Lech Wałęsa on the radio because he was just a private citizen. Anne had taken the already fairly eccentric step of studying Soviet and East European politics at St Antony's, and then gave up her postgraduate degree in order to go and be a stringer for The Economist.
You make it sound like that was a sacrifice. But
and it was an inspiration for me, because I was languishing at the BBC being bossed around by all these people. I thought, Anne is having great fun in Warsaw, I will do the same in Prague. And we've been friends.
Which is where we met, yes.
And we've been friends ever since. So I think that I want to break this down a bit into the sort of past, present and future. And we've learnt an awful lot since February the 24th. Some people have learned things that they ought to have known a long time ago, like Russia is imperialist or where Ukraine is on a map. But even people who are quite well informed have learned things that they didn't know. So I want to look a little bit at what we've learnt about Russia, what we've learnt about Ukraine, what we've learnt about Europe and America and the West in general. And then based on that, get onto our kind of to-do list, what we need to do in the coming days, weeks and months in order that Ukraine wins not only militarily, which is the immediate priority, and this is it wonderful, we're now saying wins rather than just doesn't lose, but also to think about what we do to make sure Ukraine wins in a kind of civilizational sense in the long term and becomes a really successful, prosperous, stable, secure, democratic country fully integrated into the rest of Europe, which is ultimately what we are fighting for. So let's start off with lessons learned. And has there been anything, let's start with the Russians, because they started this war back in 2014 in Ukraine and against the rest of the world pretty much in 1992, some of us would say. What have we learnt about Russia that we didn't know already? What have been the big surprises of the last 6 months for you?
First of all, let me echo Edward's thanks to the entire Ukrainian Institute and to all of you for coming today and continuing to support this important cause. You know, what have we learned about the Russians? One of the things we learned about the Russians is that they don't understand very much about Ukraine. And I'm not 100% sure that we learned that. That might have been guessable before the war. But what we know from the way the war was launched, from the way it was planned, from the way it was carried out, that the Russians had a completely different idea of what they were going to discover when their troops crossed the border. So they assumed that this was a weak and degenerate country, which is what their propaganda told them. They believed that their network of agents and influencers inside the country would very quickly take over. That they would take over Kiev as well as all the other major cities. Their soldiers who crossed the northern border and aimed for Kiev in the first days of the war were carrying with them dress uniforms to wear at the victory parade that they expected to hold in Kiev. So they had a very poor idea of what they were fighting and what they were up against. Another thing that we've learned about Russia, and this was more of a surprise, it was certainly a surprise in Washington, which is where I was on the day the war broke out, and I had conversations with people there in the weeks leading up to it. One of the things we've also learned is that the Russian army is much weaker, much more poorly organized, and much less modernized than we expected it to be. And this is true on several levels. One is that they had not, in fact, modernized the way their chain of command works. It's a very stiffly organized, centrally organized army. They don't have the system that the Ukrainians have adopted and that is used by most NATO armies of allowing junior officers to make split-second decisions. So it's very, they have a lot of trouble being flexible. We've also learned that their logistics are very poor. You know, among other amazing details, that they don't rotate the tires of their trucks, so of their lorries, so the tires don't last as long as they should. But that's symptomatic of deeper problems. You know, the army is a part of the society, and it's a reflection of the society in important ways. And Russia is a profoundly corrupt society in which a few people at the top feel it's their right to siphon off money from state institutions and to privatize that money and to privatize state resources. This is a process that's been going on since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And continues to this day. And we had somehow assumed that that would not affect the army, or that the army would have some kind of special place in Russian society because of its importance and so on. And all of that turned out not to be true. It turned out that, in fact, the army was just as corrupt and badly managed as so much else. So I should say that doesn't mean the army is not lethal and that that its weapons don't work or that it can't fight. Parts of it can. It just turned out to be less modern and less flexible and less capable than we expected it. I would like to say that we've learned something about Russian society as well, but I'm not sure that we have yet. You know, what you have seen in Russia, I saw Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's one of the more remarkable and braver Russian dissidents, a democratic politician, who's now in prison and has been conducting interviews and having conversations with people via his lawyers, which Alexei Navalny was also able to do until recently. Said something in the last few days, or that was published in the last few days, that's very interesting. And he said, you know, on Red Square in 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, there were 7 people who protested, 6 or 7, I think. And you know, since this war began, 16,400 people have been detained and gone to prison. So it feels like nothing has changed, but in fact there have been changes. There is you can see the deep discomfort in Russian society by the number of people who have fled the country. And I know that this is not enough for Ukrainians. It's not been, and everybody else, it's not stopped the war. It's not proof that Russia has definitively changed or has become somehow, has recognized the disaster of imperialism. In fact, the disaster that imperialism has created for Russians as well as for all of Russia's neighbors. But we don't see a society functioning with a lot of warlike enthusiasm. You don't see people marching in the streets in favor of the war unless they've been bussed in there and have been told they have to do it. So it's what we're seeing is a Russia that has been taught to be apathetic. People have been taught that politics is not for them. They should stay out of it and they should stay away from it. And this apathy applies across the board. And I don't know whether it's good news or bad news, but that's another piece of what we've learned since the war began.
I was wondering as I was bicycling here, well actually not bicycling, stuck in the traffic post-marathon, but plenty of time to think, whether we should start off with Russia, because it's one of the things that bothers me is that for a lot of the world, this is all about Russia, and Ukraine is in the story as a sort of supporting actor, the kind of the murder victim in the mystery, but everything's about the perpetrator and the perpetrator's mindset. So but I decided it would be right to kick off on Russia, but I do want to keep the discussion as we go forward centred on Ukraine, which is in the end the point. But while we're still on Russia, the other sort of big element in Russia, perhaps the most important one, is Vladimir Putin. And there's been a lot of speculation in the West that he's gone mad, that he's was already mad, that he's in a corner, that we need to give him an off-ramp. But I thought that his latest speech marked a sort of yet another notch in the direction of really kind of fascist rhetoric. And if you haven't already seen it, I do recommend Timothy Garton-Ash's piece in the FT this week, where he said, if you're worried about fascism in Europe, don't worry about the Sweden Democrats, don't worry about the Brothers of Italy. There's a clear fascist regime taking shape in Russia with the glorification of violence, the personality cult, the enormous sort of symbolic manifestations of loyalty, and so on. All that obviously has deep roots. But Anne, has anything changed in your understanding of Putin in the last 6 months?
Sadly, no. So I've worried about Putin from the day he became head of the FSB, when his first act as head of the FSB was to hang a portrait of Yuri Andropov at the FSB building in Moscow. And even then, he was referring to himself with pride as a Chekist. So he's understood from the beginning of the time he came to lead Russia, he's understood himself as the proud inheritor of the sort of KGB, OGPU, Cheka tradition. And he's always seen himself in that mode, and he continues to see the world through that lens. And so he doesn't see any spontaneous movement inside Russia as normal political opposition. He sees it as evidence of, a Western spying operation. When he looks at Ukraine, he doesn't see a country where there is legitimate politics and where there's there's a legitimate arguments take place. He sees it as also some kind of arm of, some combination of the CIA, NATO, and the United States. He sees the world through a kind of paranoid lens, which is built around himself. And most of what he does is, in fact, when you look at his motives, it's about his desire to stay in power. This war, it's very interesting. I mean, I think for Russian rulers over many centuries, in fact, war has always been an opportunity to eliminate opposition, get rid of reformers, lock up whoever bothers you, and try and achieve some kind of alternate glory when you can't achieve anything at home. I mean, he's in many senses, in the last several years in particular, his strategy of saying to Russians, essentially, you let me steal and, I'll make sure your pensions get paid on time, and we just won't talk, you won't criticize me, and that will be the deal. That deal has been failing. In fact, as the army is one piece of evidence, the society is so profoundly corrupt that it became more than obvious what was happening and what was going on, and it became possible for people like Navalny or like Kara-Murza to get big crowds onto the streets and to create a genuine grassroots opposition movement in the country, which he has very brutally crushed. But it's important to remember that much of this is happening. The war started because he felt himself to be losing. He was losing an argument about democracy. He was losing an argument about what is the future of Russia. He felt that conquering Ukraine would reestablish some kind of Russian empire and would also reestablish his particular form of autocratic kleptocracy as undefeatable. And it's even more clear that he's losing now. He wouldn't be conducting this mass, chaotic mobilization. He wouldn't be doing these emergency annexations if he felt the war was going well and he was certain that he was going to win it. What you see is somebody who's increasingly aware. Finally, he's becoming aware that his ambitions are overplayed and that he won't succeed. And the question of how we should think about him and we should think about, his future, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit more. The most important thing we can do to shape the future of Russia in a positive way is make sure that we win the war in Ukraine. Winning the war in Ukraine, and by which I mean Ukraine takes back its territories, remains a sovereign country, and as you say, becomes integrated into Europe, should force his generation and a whole generation of Russians to come to the conclusion that the war was a mistake, and that empire itself is a mistake, and that their political system is a failure. And that's really people like to talk about how we can influence the Kremlin or who we can talk to, or, is there some other person we can support? We don't have any leverage like that, and it's really fantasy to imagine that we do. We should be focused on making sure that the war is won, and that Russians are then draw the lessons from it.
If you haven't already read it, I would recommend Alexei Navalny's long piece in the Washington Post, Smuggled Out of Prison, I think published a couple of days ago, which was an absolutely unambiguous support of Ukraine's war aims, and I think marks an important point in that story. And I think that for me, the really striking thing is the divergence of Russia's military capability and Putin's political aims. And Lawrence Friedman, who's perhaps Britain's leading authority on strategy and military things, highlights this in his latest newsletter. And so the demands that Putin is putting on the system are getting ever greater than what his system can deliver. But let's talk briefly, because I don't want to get onto Ukraine, which is the most important thing, but let's talk a bit about the West. Because Putin's big misunderstanding was not only that he thought that Ukraine would be a pushover, but he thought that the West would be a pushover. He thought that we would cower under the threat of nuclear weapons, that we would cower under the threat of the gas and energy cut-offs, that the public would revolt, that Europe would split, that America was fundamentally disengaged from Europe and distracted by internal polarization and by things elsewhere. And all of that's turned out to be wrong. And in fact, perhaps Putin's greatest political legacy may be that he's revived NATO and restored the West as a sort of geopolitical force.
Yes, Putin made the mistake of believing his own propaganda and believing the far-right accounts of American and French and British and European politics that he helps to fund and produce, but also that he assumes are the truth. There have even been, over the last few weeks and months, some almost, if it wasn't also gruesome, it would be funny, moments when Putin referring to arguments about trans rights, for example, in the West as evidence of degeneracy and decay, and he's kind of intimately acquainted with some of the details of the arguments and who's making them, which, it made me think, is there a Western leader who could, who's following Russian social media and could tell you, which person is on which side of that issue in Russia? I don't think so. Yeah. But that means that he's, this is what he focuses on and what he, how he builds his view of the world. I do think that when he says the West is degenerate, he means it. That's what he thinks. And I do think that he has been surprised by the unity in the United States and by the agreement across Europe, and by so far really actually rather remarkable, in Germany, in Italy, in Austria, in a number of countries that are very dependent on Russian gas. We have so far had pretty good unity and pretty good, and the alliance is held together. Within each country there's an argument, and there are both people on the Russian side of the argument and people who are worried about economics and so on. So I don't want to act as if there's no opposition, but so far there's been much more resistance than I think he expected. And I think this is partly a result of Russia's brutality. The way Russia has behaved in Ukraine simply reminds Europeans and Americans and Canadians of events of the past that we thought were long gone. So when you see, if you put the photographs of and the film footage of tanks rolling across Ukraine and refugees escaping, and if you made them black and white, it would look like World War II, and everybody immediately saw that, and that has triggered a kind of hidden reflex in many European countries that has made people understand what level of danger we're at and why this is why this war is different and so significant. I would say, though, and this is maybe how we get on to the main topic, another explanation, one of the reasons why the West has so far held together and why even in bitterly polarized United States, Ukraine remains a kind of bipartisan issue, is the behavior of the Ukrainians. The Zelensky's decision to stay in Kiev, his famous film of himself and his closest colleagues standing in the courtyard outside the presidential administration building, their clarity about why they were going to stay, the bravery with which the Ukrainians have fought, the extraordinary effort of volunteers and activists all across society. I had the opportunity to meet a lot of them when I was in Kiev and Odessa last summer. All of this has inspired people in the Western world in a way I don't think people thought they could still be inspired. One of the, a friend of mine has put it in a very succinct way. If in the West, and this is especially true of the United States, we've had over the last generation a kind of culture war between so-called, liberal values on the one hand and so-called something like nationalism or patriotism on the other hand. And we've acted as if those things were different and they were, in opposition to one another. Zelensky and the Ukrainian people have shown us that you can have a patriotic, military even, defense of liberal values and you can succeed. And I think this has created, an unexpected, I think, even wave of support for Ukraine that I don't think anybody predicted before the war.
I think at this point we've highlighted all sorts of, if you like, dividends from the war. It's discredited Putin, put his system under enormous strain. It's woken the West's eyes to the evils of Russian imperialism. It's united the West and so on. And this all sounds wonderful. And of course, there's one enormous element missing from this, which is the absolutely enormous cost. And one of the things that bothers me a bit in our coverage of the war and its consequences is we almost take for granted the resilience and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And I think it's really important at every point just to remember thousands and thousands and thousands of people are dead. We don't know how many are dead because there's obviously Russian casualties a bit uncertain. We know many, many thousands of people are dead. Many tens of thousands of people have had life-changing physical or mental injuries. The trauma is going to be with us for a generation, with extraordinary physical destruction, biggest physical destruction of infrastructure we've ever seen in Europe, bigger even than in terms of the cost of reconstruction, even bigger than the Second World War. When you think what we're going to have to do to put it back again, and this is a kind of enormous negative side on the balance sheet, and in a way it's a paradox that because Ukraine has been so incredibly resilient, we kind of take it for granted, and massacres and explosions and rockets hitting infrastructure and apartment blocks, which would have been on the front page 6 months ago, are now buried on a sort of short piece on page 8. But Anne, you've been to Ukraine a lot. You've seen, you've interviewed Zelensky. You've been on this magic train from Warsaw along the path then followed by many other politicians, but you did it very early on. You've interviewed different sorts of the volunteers, the Belarusian volunteers and so on. So you've really got a pretty good grip on what's happening. What has been your lesson to you about Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian state over the last 6 months?
So the most, it's almost a cliche at this point to say it, but the most remarkable thing about Ukraine, and it serves it in not always in the best way. Ukraine is a grassroots society. It's a down-up society rather than an up-down one. And Ukrainians have always been fantastically good at organizing spontaneous civic or charitable or cultural actions. In some ways, the paradigmatic Ukrainian event is a festival, a music festival or a literary festival. I've been to several of them in Ukraine over the last decade. It's the idea that you gather people together using volunteers and create something. This is a kind of archetypic Ukrainian way of doing politics and creating a social event. Ukrainians have been less good at creating state institutions. There's been a suspicion of power and suspicion of people in power that goes back decades. It certainly goes back to the Holodomor, if not earlier, and a feeling that somehow people who are in power are not to be trusted. I mean, I hope that this war will end that as people have learned to have trust for the behavior of local mayors. It's turned out to be very important that mayors are elected in Ukraine, because very often they've played a huge role, including in some occupied cities, in creating resistance or in helping people escape or evacuate and so on. And so the down-up nature of Ukrainian society has been really important. And I don't know of another war in modern times that you can say that has been fought quite like this one. So everybody you meet in Ukraine is supporting a battalion, or supplies or uniforms for a group of soldiers that they know. It's almost as if the Ukrainian army, which of course it's a professional army, and of course it's actually, as we are learning, a very well-trained and competent army, but it has some features of a partisan army as well, in that it sort of uses the resources of the population, and then the population of course draws on resources of the world. I mean, through fundraising, like this organization does, and other groups. Using its skills and talents brings supplies, brings aid, brings help to the army. And so even the army is kind of organized on the grassroots level in a way we don't think of armies normally as doing. And some of this is because Ukraine is not a wealthy country, and it didn't have, not every soldier has the night vision goggles that he should have had at the beginning of the war. But you would be amazed by how many do now have night vision goggles that have been crowdsourced, by somebody running a campaign on Instagram, or somebody collecting money at a church in somewhere in the American Midwest. And so there is this sense in which the society is supporting the army and is connected to the army in a way that feels almost a little bit pre-modern, but it's very appealing. Last night I was showing some British friends something that they hadn't seen, which is the various different kinds of music videos that Ukrainian soldiers create. So they will create little videos, sometimes with kind of electronic music or other music, showing themselves in various, sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're not so funny. But the videos, of course, then circulate in the population, and there's this connection between the soldiers and people that's been created by social media that I think is pretty unique. And I'm not aware of another war that's been conducted quite like this. And I think everybody, I hope that everybody who thinks about security and everybody who thinks about defense is now watching closely the way in which the Ukrainian army is integrated with the Ukrainian population.
It's a very interesting sort of, not quite tension, but contrast between the way in which this war in a way is deeply rooted in historical arguments, Russia's appropriation of Rus, for example, Russia's understanding of what it means to be a Russian speaker, the history of the Holodomor, brief gasps of statehood in 1918. So much of what's going on is really hard to understand if you don't know the history. And yet, in the other sense, the war is incredibly modern. This I think, is the most. It's a war that combines the use of social media and extremely sophisticated production values of Zelensky's speeches. I guess everybody in the audience. Actually, how many people in the audience are Ukrainian or have got a family connection with Ukraine? Sorry, let me rephrase that. Is there anyone in the audience who doesn't have a family connection with Ukraine? Okay, yeah, there are a few. Okay.
Half and half.
It's a forest of hands. But I thought that the speech that Zelensky made to the non-ethnic Russians, the other peoples of Russia, in front of the statue of Shamil in downtown Kiev was
just a few days ago.
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary piece of rhetoric. It should go into the textbooks.
You should explain it. Just one sentence. Just one
why
sentence.
don't you explain it?
No.
Well, he pointed out that, and first of all, I guess everyone here knows who Shamil was, the great Chechen fighter who led the, for a long time, successful but ultimately unsuccessful resistance to Tsarist colonization of the Caucasus in the 1860s, and features in Haji Murat by Tolstoy, and also a rather less good book called The Sabres of Paradise by Leslie Blanche, which is lighter reading if you want to read that. So it's nice when people laugh when you mention these really obscure books. It shows other people read them too. Shamil is a kind of fairly controversial figure in Russia. It's sort of, I don't know who the counterpart in English history would be, Owen Glendower or Braveheart.
Braveheart.
Yeah, but he's there's a wonderful statue to him in downtown, or a bust of him downtown Kiev. And Zelensky made this very good speech about Russian colonialism and said it's the Russians, the ethnic Russians have taken away and trampled on your language and your cultures over decades and centuries, and now they're sending you, the Buryats and Tuvans and other people who've lost so much of their economic, social, cultural standing under Russian rule, and now they're turning you into cannon fodder, and you don't have to do this. And I think that this is getting back again to Russia, and I want to keep it focused on Ukraine, but I thought that Zelensky's fluency in the sort of anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist discourse is immensely powerful, and if it takes root in Russia, it could have really profound effects there, as well as being very good in the rest of the world. And I also thought that that Putin, one of the most significant things of the past week or so was Putin's introduction of tough new laws with penalties for desertion, mutiny and looting. This is not looting of Ukrainians, that's kind of allowed in the Russian military. This is looting your own side's stores, and these are now very severely punished in Russian military, and that to me suggests that there's some quite serious problems there.
There's a morale problem.
Yes.
And those are, by the way, laws that existed in Stalin's time.
Yes, and I mean it's literally the demoralization, not in just losing the will to fight, but losing the will to obey any sort of rules. So I think that encouraging mutinies and desertions in the Russian military may be quite a powerful thing. But I just wanted to, you wrote a piece about the Belarusian volunteers, and it's one of the things that's, I think, particularly important about this is the way in which the Ukrainian cause has almost reignited the spirit of 1863. It's the countries that resisted Tsarist autocracy in that revolt, which was crushed, Poland, Lithuania and Belarus, where the Ukrainian cause particularly resonates. So just tell us a bit what you found about the Belarusians, and also any thoughts about why Belarus has been such a reluctant ally for Putin.
So yes, I met, I arranged to meet in Warsaw. By the way, Warsaw is now Casablanca. Warsaw is the city that everybody has to go through in order to get to Ukraine, and it's kind of meeting point of all kinds of different people who wouldn't have been there 10 years ago. But it's now one of the hubs of the Belarusian opposition, and a couple of months ago, I met a group of young Belarusians who were preparing to join the Ukrainian army, and they had come to a meeting point in Warsaw where they had had a little bit of training, and they were just about to get in their cars and drive to the border. And there is a Belarusian legion, or sort of Belarusian regiment, which is part of the Ukrainian army, as there is also a Georgian legion, and as more famously, there's an international legion. But these were Belarusians who understood absolutely, I mean, there was no doubt in their minds that the war for Ukrainian independence was also a war for their independence, and that they needed to fight with Ukraine in order to someday maybe liberate Minsk. And they understood absolutely that the Russian desire to dominate Ukraine was connected to the desire to dominate Belarus. And there's even a sense in which the Russian, essentially the Russian takeover of Belarus after the street demonstrations and stolen election of 2020 was one of the reasons why the invasion was possible. So Lukashenko opened up his country essentially for Russia. Russia had kept him in power. They had given him support from police and media and army, and essentially are now keeping him in power. And that's why they were able to move their troops into the north of the Ukrainian border in preparation for the invasion. So they understood very clearly that their country was somehow co-responsible for this invasion, and they wanted to do something about it. I'm not sure if it was them or other people like them. I saw a couple of weeks later in Kiev training. They were wearing balaclavas, so I wasn't told whether it was the same people I'd met in Warsaw. But it is a small but serious fighting group that hopes to make a difference. But I mean, I think the Belarusian story shows how well understood in the whole region the significance of the war is. I mean, if you want an explanation for why there was this enormous Polish grassroots support for Ukraine, which, by the way, preceded the government support. So there was a Polish movement to help Ukrainian refugees that, was created instantaneously as soon as the war began. If you want to understand why the Baltic states are so involved, if you want to understand why the Georgians care so much about it, it's because all of them understand that a Russia that takes over Ukraine and a Russia that, once again creates an empire is immediately a danger for them, and a genuine physical danger as well as a kind of ideological danger.
And also the historical trauma of occupation, deportation, indoctrination. This is something that is absolutely in living memory for them.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the way that the Russians have behaved in occupied Ukraine, I mean, I have to tell you, for me, I wrote a book called Iron Curtain, which is a book about the Sovietization of Central Europe after the war. And I know that although it doesn't look like a book that's directly relevant to the Ukrainian war, I think of all the things I've written, it's in fact the most relevant, even more so than the book about the famine, because then it was the Soviet Union. What the Soviet Union did when it came into Eastern Poland or Eastern Hungary or into the Baltic states at the end of the war was exactly what they're doing in occupied Ukraine now. And so they have a clear understanding of how to behave. They immediately attack and eliminate the upper level of society, however you define it. So the mayor, the city councilman, the policeman, in some cases university professors. In Melitopol, there's a Crimean museum director who's disappeared. And so the intellectual and cultural elite of each place is arrested and eliminated. And then they move down society looking for so-called, Ukrainian activists, meaning really anybody who speaks Ukrainian or teaches Ukrainian, or, they look for tattoos on people's arms. There's a fashion among some young Ukrainians to have, a sheaf of wheat on your arm or some other Ukrainian symbol, and anybody who has that is liable to arrest. And then the gathering of all such people into these so-called filtration camps, which, by the way, is the same word that was used also at the end of the Second World War to process people to filtration camps, and then the deportation of those people to Russia is so chillingly familiar. I mean, it is exactly what was done in 1945. I suppose the difference now, they don't have, labor camps set up to receive people, and it looks like they're kind of dumping people all over Russia in children's camps or, school gymnasiums, and some of them seem to be stuck there, and some of them are finding their way back. But the process, the way of thinking, that if we crush the society intellectually and morally as well as physically, then we can take it over, is really exactly the same. So the elimination of textbooks, taking over schools, forcing people to take Russian passports, forbidding the use of the Ukrainian language, forbidding the Ukrainian national anthem. I mean, all of that is exactly, echoes behavior, much of what they did in the past.
Guns and money, that's what Ukraine needs to win. Anything else?
It's interesting. I mean, it's not just guns. It's very specific. I mean, what's the real turning point in the war came in July, which is when the American long-range precision artillery arrived, famous HIMARS. And that has enabled, for the first time, really enabled Ukrainians to gain an advantage. So there are other probably people in the room who know the military situation and story better than me, but the main problem facing the Ukrainians from the beginning was just that they were outnumbered. There are a lot more Russians, they have a lot more stuff, they have a lot more ammunition, and even if half the guns don't work, there's still there's still more. And so it was really the quantity that has been the biggest problem for them. And what this precision ammunition does is it makes it possible for them to target ammunition dumps and to target very specific military headquarters and so on, which makes it difficult for the Russians to fight. And I should add another aspect of that is they have been aided enormously by resistance in the occupied territories. And this resistance, I mean, some of it is like young guys with guns buried in the woods, which is what you think it is, but it's also little old ladies with smartphones, who hobble by the military base, take a little photograph, and then they upload it. There are websites where you can upload the pictures so that the Ukrainian army can geolocate them and figure out where they are. So there's quite a lot of, once again, very, very cutting edge techniques being used to gather information in the region, and that's another so far untold piece of the story.
What are your biggest worries now? I mean, it's easy to stitch this together into a story of Russian collapse, Ukrainian resurgence, Western solidarity, and Putin's doom. But I think that's too tempting. So what are your biggest worries?
So, I mean, I've thought about this a lot. The only way I can see the war actually ending for some long period of time is, as I've said, for the Ukrainians to win in some way that demonstrates to the Russians that the war was a mistake, and for them to conclude it was a mistake. But, getting from here to there are a lot of obstacles. I mean, one we've already touched on, which is can the Western coalition hold together? I mean, my instinct is that it will for some time, partly because the one country that matters the most, which is the United States, appears to be dedicated to the cause and has actually even upped the amount of military spending in the last few days. And really, American weapons matter more than almost anything else. The Germans have made preparations for winter on the assumption that they will not have any Russian gas. So they've begun filling their cisterns in other ways. They're trying to get gas from other sources. And so that looks to me like, in both cases, both Washington and Berlin look to me like places where people are preparing for the long haul. And that's good. I mean, the second kind of obstacle that is, which is really the most important obstacle and the one that we don't know, is what happens in Moscow when the Russians really do understand that they've lost. There is no magic formula by which Putin disappears. One of the strange things about Russian politics right now is not only do we not know who would ever succeed him, we don't know who would choose that person. So there is no council of elders, there is no succession mechanism. There isn't even a Politburo and a central committee. So there is no institutional way to replace him. And what we don't know is how he'll behave if he, again, perceives loss. I mean, I do think that the events of this week, both the mobilization and this, bizarre annexation announcement were evidence that he's beginning to realize he's losing. But what we don't know is what he'll do down the line. Whether he'll use. He'll begin targeting Ukraine, Kiev or the Ukrainian electricity system, or use cyber warfare or even nuclear weapons. I doubt he will do the latter, because it's very hard, even if he were to do it, to see how that helps him win. And it would have all kinds of negative, all kinds of other things would happen if he did it. And so my guess is he won't, I can't promise anything, but there's an enormous unknown in what will the Russians do as they start to lose, and how will they behave. And as I said, there are all kinds of ways in which things could go wrong. I mean, the other thing we don't know is who would replace Putin even if he were somehow to be removed. And, you know, there are a lot of other ugly people in Moscow who could take his job.
I think it's really important to remember that just as our problems with Russia predate Putin, they will also outlast him. And one of my big worries is that we get some kind of superficial regime change, whether it's a knock on the door or shots in the courtyard, but one way or another Putin is removed and we get perhaps some kind of junta or someone else in charge who then says to the West, look, you know, I'm willing to be reasonable, but you've got to give me something. And the West then thinks, well, this is a chance to end the war, let's give the new guy a chance, it almost certainly will be a guy, and then start thinking about whether to arm twist Ukraine. Some of you may know Hannah Shellest from Odessa, who was asked this by an Italian journalist and said, we've got to give Putin something. And she said, great, what about Lake Como? Which is a very, very good response. But I see this fantastic amount of talent in the room. I just looking round, I see Jade, there's Constance, there's Natalia at the back. There's many friendly faces, familiar faces, and also some very expert ones. So it'd be very good to have some questions if anybody would like. And while you're thinking of questions to ask, and we'll finish pretty much at 6:30, so we've got just over half an hour for that. But Anne, do you want to ask me a question? I've been bombarding you with questions.
You know, what is your view of the prospects for change in Moscow?
I think it's been about I've been watching Putin since indeed he became head of the FSB. When almost my first story I wrote when I arrived in Moscow in '98 was that he'd got this important job, and I was deeply worried about it then, against a background of worry about other things that Russia had been up to in the previous 6 or 7 years. And I think the last 3 weeks have been the worst 3 weeks of his entire 22 years in power. This is worse than the sinking of the Kursk, it's worse than the terrorist outrages of Beslan and...
you mean worse from his point of view?
Yes, in terms of his political difficulties. The combination of the diplomatic snubs from India, China and Turkey and Kazakhstan. Those are 4 of the most important countries there are for him, and they've all to be stood up publicly and made to wait by the leader of Kyrgyzstan is really humiliating for a Russian president. These are people you keep waiting, not people who keep you waiting. So the diplomatic front is looking pretty bad, and it's an interesting question. If you wanted to escalate, what the Chinese would think about that. They don't seem to be at all thrilled about the war in principle, because they don't like land grabs, but also the way it's working out for them. You've got these military setbacks, which are colossal, and this is really the Ukrainian advances in the north and the continuing difficulties in Kherson don't look quickly solvable, whatever he does. And then this sort of the rivets are popping internally, with Kadyrov being openly insubordinate, people like Girkin and others continuing up their fusillade of criticism from this nationalist right, which I've always previously thought was just a creation of the FSB to make us scared, you know, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse, and this is the something worse that has long made the West think whoever's in the Kremlin is probably better than the alternative. But I think that the far right has taken on a bit of a life of its own. And there are people who are criticising, and Prigozhin as well seems to be on manoeuvres, these strange videos so there seems to be some ferment, and also the strange unexplained 12-hour delay of the speech. So I think there's the pressure's building up. Now, you never know when pressure builds up in a boiler how far over its design strength it can go, and when it does go, which bit pops. But I think the needle is moving into the red zone, and I don't see how he brings it down again. Now, that doesn't necessarily make me optimistic, because I think whoever comes after Putin may actually be able to blame the mistakes in the conduct of the war on him, demand concessions from the West, and possibly do new nastier things in order to, or want to do new nasty things in order to establish their legitimacy. So we may well go out of the Putin-esque frying pan into some unknown fire.
On the other hand, I once looked up the obituary of Stalin that was produced in the Times of London right after he died, in 1953. And the line that jumped out at me was, and now we're very worried about the hardliners waiting in the wings to take over. I mean, who's more hardline than Stalin? So we do have this then I looked up, by the way, either obituaries or commentaries written when Khrushchev and Brezhnev and others disappeared. Every single time one of them was deposed or died, there was exactly the same commentary. Oh no, now it's going to get much worse. So,
followed by extreme tolerance to whoever took over. So we were wildly over-enthusiastic about Andropov, then we were over-enthusiastic about Gorbachev, and then we were over-enthusiastic about Yeltsin, and then we were over-enthusiastic about Putin. And we would have been over-enthusiastic about Chernenko if he hadn't died before we got the chance. Anyway, let's. So hands up. Most people here will know most people here, but not everybody knows everybody. So please do introduce yourself. I'm going to work my way around the room, sort of going this way. So first of all, I've got Constance Vishin, who is part of my campaign team, trying to win the next door seat for Lib Dem. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe. Well, actually, we should do one little commercial interruption.
Yes.
What? One little announcement, which is that Edward is the Liberal candidate for Parliament from Marylebone City constituency.
City of London, Westminster.
City of London and Westminster, sorry, excuse me, City of London and Westminster. So keep that in mind if any of you are voting. All right, now return to the...
So this presentation is called Ukraine Can Win, and it's a question for both of you, and it's about what we're doing in the United Kingdom and the thing of kleptocracy. And do you think we're doing enough? I mean, we have a new government. Do you think we're doing enough to support Ukraine so Ukraine can win?
Sorry, we in this context is...
Britain and dirty...
Britain.
Dirty money.
There's a couple ways to look at it. I know that Britain is very limited in what weapons it is still able to give, because in fact the British Army and the British defense establishment had shrunk quite a bit in the run-up to this war. And the British are, in compensation for that, they are doing this massive training program of Ukrainian soldiers, which I know is hugely appreciated. So I'm, given that they haven't got that many guns left, I'm glad that they are able to do that. I would like to see, and Edward is really the expert on this rather than me. In fact, it's one of his campaign themes. I would like to see, this business of sanctioning a few oligarchs and whatever, taking their yachts and so on. It's very satisfying, and it creates kind of feel-good news stories. But it doesn't really stem this systemic problem with the City of London, which is still functions to enable money laundering and hiding of money all over the world, not just in Russia. And if you're really serious about pushing back against oligarchy and pushing back against autocracy, then really that's where we should all begin. And this is true, by the way, just as true for the United States as it is for the United Kingdom. We begin with cleaning up our laws and our banking system so that they can't be used by autocrats to gain and keep power.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge subject, and we've only scratched the surface of what needs to be done with the rather limited reforms we've had in economic crime bills and so on. It's a sad truth that other people's money has kept this country afloat since the end of the British Empire. And if you haven't already read it, I strongly recommend Oliver Bullo's books, Butler to the World, and the one before that, Moneyland, which explain this in excruciatingly and brilliant but embarrassing detail. I think that the good thing is that kleptocracy is now on the agenda internationally. There's a bipartisan consensus in the United States about it. People see that dirty money is a national security threat. And it's a bit like disinformation. When Anne and I first wrote our first report on disinformation for CEPA in, 2014, something like that?
2015.
2015. there was an idea that disinformation is a problem for sort of rinky-dink countries that you can't find on the map, but the idea it would actually matter in a serious Western democracy was considered very eccentric. And then, of course, we had 2016 and the Russian attack on the American political system, and it stopped being so eccentric. And I think we're seeing the same sort of learning curve, that dirty money is not just the way that dodgy lawyers buy an extra yacht and some exotic person has an exotic divorce, which you can read about in the tabloids if you want, but it's nothing to do with me. It actually goes to the heart of our society, and we are in danger in Britain of being a country that is run by the dodgy rich for the dodgy rich. And I don't think the public is aware of quite how much a role dirty money plays, both in direct donations from people who, we have to be very careful, this is being recorded, it will be on the internet, so I'm not going to mention any names or countries. So I actually spent nearly a year of my life defending The Economist, organising The Economist defence in a libel suit brought by an extremely scary foreigner, and it was one of the most unpleasant experiences of my life, and I have no desire to repeat it. So we've got to do an awful lot about this. One is to change the libel law so that we can actually talk about it properly. We did have a change in the libel law. It was then watered down and didn't bring the benefits we thought. We need to reform Companies House so that it's in the time that you've been listening to us talking, you could have been on your phones setting up dozens and dozens of fake companies with names like Ukrainian Institute, or you could register a company in the name of Mr. Swedenborg, even though he's been dead for ages. You could call it Ukrainian Institute Inc., and you wouldn't be breaking the law. No one would check. So there's an enormous hole in our system, and it's very easy for us to blame British Virgin Islands or some other place, but actually the real sort of smithy, the mint where fake companies and fake partnerships are made is here. And then there's a huge industry around it which wants very badly to defend its lucrative, not even niche, great lump of money. And it's a really, really serious problem. And I don't think that the previous government got to grips with it. I'm delighted that Tom Tugendhat, who's a friend of ours and mine, is now Security Minister, and he's been tasked with going after dirty Russian and Chinese money. I wonder what happens when that trail starts leading to people who are donors to the Conservative Party or have business associates who are donors to the Conservative Party. And my wonderful campaign team will continue to hold them to account on this. Let's have another question. We're working our way around. Jade, introduce yourself.
My name is Stephen Glenn. I'm sorry losing my voice, so I hope go past here. But thank you to Ukrainian Institute for hosting us, and thank you to the speaker and moderator. My question is about what happens when Ukraine wins, and the longer term, going back to a question you raised early on about integration, European integration, perhaps also North Atlantic integration, because I've interviewed a lot of Russians over the last few months who are either for the war or accept the war, and even those who are honest about the war being a bad idea, they cannot fathom the notion that Ukraine would win. I think it will cause such a huge psychological, and we can of course say it's well deserved, but it will cause such a huge psychological turbulence in society.
Right.
It's incredibly unpredictable what will happen. So I'm very sceptical anything positive will happen in the short to medium term in Russia. So how do we ensure that Ukraine stays safe, let's say, after it's won still, and what structure should it be integrated into to ensure that? Sorry, another question.
Yeah, well, I think, and this is one of the great problems that wars are very bad for countries. And I often look at France post 1945, and it's not a direct comparison, but you had huge tensions between people who'd collaborated, people who didn't, people who'd been the occupied part, people who hadn't been occupied, people who got compensated, didn't get compensation, people who got medals, didn't get medals, and that trauma has lasted for decades. Some people would say that France is still not really over Vichy. So I think post-war Ukraine is going to have some very major traumas to deal with, and I'd be interested to know what you think about how we can help heal them.
Well, I understood the question to be also about Ukrainian integration into Western institutions. I mean, if you'd asked me before the war, I would have said, I can't imagine Ukraine in NATO. Now I can. That doesn't mean it will definitely happen or that I can give you a date, you know, or a time or anything like that. But I think there has been a changing understanding of who the Ukrainians are and even how they could be an important part of NATO. I mean, there was also, we could have mentioned this at the beginning, you know, if the Russians underestimated Ukraine, many Western, including Western military establishments, also underestimated Ukraine, maybe even particularly the Pentagon. They too thought the war was going to be over quickly. And the respect for the Ukrainian military and the creative way in which it's used NATO weapons that it, you know, in many cases had not been tried or they hadn't trained on them before the war, has built them up this enormous well of respect in the kind of defense worlds of Europe and North America. And so I can now imagine it. And you're right to point to that because, you know, one of the things that's necessary for us to say Ukraine has won is exactly what Ukraine needs is some, you know, we need a Ukraine that is stable enough to reinvest in, that will, you know, that foreign investment can go into, that Ukrainians themselves can invest to, that Ukrainians will want to come back to. You know, we need the refugees to go home. And we need to give them some feeling of security. And of course, if the war ends in some way that Ukrainians don't feel secure, then they won't go home and nobody will invest there. I mean, there are precedents. There are examples of countries that live in hostile environments that, you know, nevertheless thrive. Sometimes the Ukrainians have sometimes pointed to Israel, but actually the better one and more interesting one is South Korea, which has effectively been at war with North Korea. You know, Seoul sits within reach of North Korean artillery, and yet it has become a stable, flourishing society with, you know, the world's most famous pop music, and you know, and they make good movies, and so you know, and so, you know, so it's not known merely as a bastion of, you know, military, you know, it's not just a defense issue, you know, place that we defend because we have to. You know, and thinking about that and thinking about how Ukraine can develop in the future, what we need is some sense of stability around the borders, however those, you know, wherever those finally end up being.
Let's have more questions. Lady there in the red shirt.
And then take some people over there.
My name is Sophia and I'm a DP who is hoping to go back to Ukraine one day. And what you said that we're about to discuss how to help Ukraine win the war and then the Ukrainian state to perpetuate itself. And but I would say that right now the Western allies have challenges of their own, beginning from the security system, in which Russia still can veto in the UN Security Council whatever decision the Security Council comes up with. And then these internal problems in, for example, I think there are certain challenges in the United States with democracy as well. Then again, with Russia, what if Russia falls apart? Or
We need just one question.
No, basically, I'm just giving these challenges, and I would like you to comment on any of them, whatever comes up. You know?
Well, I think that's what Anne's written a brilliant book called Twilight of Democracy. So I'll park that for a moment, and Anne can answer about the West's challenges. And let's. I realise we've got about 20 minutes left, and a forest of hands. So can we have the gentleman in the front here in the pale grey? Hang on.
This way. My name is Christopher Sobert. You were talking about things to worry about. I think another thing to worry about is the possibility that Ukraine may simply not have enough soldiers. Well, we're sending guns, sending money, sending people, we're not sending troops to Ukraine. I'm not suggesting we should, but will they have enough troops of their own to carry on for a long time?
Right, thank you. That's one for us both to think about. And let's have a question. Sorry, I'm going to break my rule and go to the gentleman here for reasons that some of you may understand.
Thank you again, both of you for. There was a 10 to 12 year period, you know, it's better than me because you were kind of covered after the fall of the Soviet Union when all the countries and the convention kind of slip through the net in both NATO eventually and then the EU. I'm just wondering now that we look back and think, well, the country that was most at threat, actually, because I think the rationale for bringing both Hungary, Poland, etc., was to ensure they never fell back into the Soviet Union as kind of reached the country most at threat, Ukraine, got left behind. Just wondering, is there any insider explanation that you can bring to bear how we could have left Ukraine out of that huge wave of countries that were in during that time?
Thanks. I mean, I blame the Bush administration for grossly mishandling the run-up to the 2008 Bucharest summit. And I think if they'd done a proper job then and hadn't been distracted by other things, we would have got a membership action plan through them. But they, first of all, said they didn't really want it, and then demanded it at the last minute and couldn't get the Germans with them, and the rest is history. And do you want to talk about either lack of soldiers or democracy, or indeed the other one?
So as I understand it, lack of soldiers isn't the biggest problem the Ukrainians face, because they have, I mean, pretty much the entire male population is prepared to fight, and many of them, as I said, are training in Britain right now. So, and they don't have the problems the Russians have of demoralization and people fleeing the country, or at least, not in those kinds of numbers. So I don't think that's the biggest problem. I didn't know that this is the right forum to discuss democracy in America. It seems like it's a pretty big topic that might deserve its own separate hour and a half. I mean, it's true that, but it is, I think the only thing that's worth saying is that there is a way in which, and I think this is understood in the White House, there is a way in which this war and victory in this war would be seen as a kind of booster even for American democracy, because it would show that democracies are capable of doing something and achieving things, and I think that's understood in the United States, and so this is understood as part of a broader struggle for democracy around the world. I mean, it's not the Cold War. We're not one block of countries fighting another block of countries, but it's more complex and nuanced than that. But I think the understanding that there is something to defend is pretty clear. And as I said, Zelensky has been very, very good at explaining that and making that case in the US and in all capitals of Europe and all over the world. I mean, that's really been the main thing that he's done, is he's tried to make the case for Ukraine not as, a regional conflict, but with something with wider implications. And I think he's been successful in doing that. Maybe it's worth saying, since people in this room may know this, I mean, not everybody in Ukraine, likes everything that he's done, and, there may be there were problems in the past and could be in the future, but this particular thing, that he rallied the populations of Europe and of the United States to this cause in this particular way was a really brilliant, great success.
You had a point at the beginning of your question, which was about the lack of security architecture, and I think that's really been exposed on this. Europe is strategically naked without the United States. The EU is stumbling towards its idea of being a geopolitical actor, but is nowhere close. The OSCE has been effectively irrelevant, the Council of Europe even more so. And as you rightly said, Russia vetoing things at the UN Security Council. And I think this is a great chance to reboot the whole international approach to defense of democracy. And I wish we were spending more time on that rather than worry about certain other things. Let's have the lady at the back with her hand up, standing by the window. And then we're going to take a bunch of questions together and give very telegraphic answers, so we at least try and get through everybody.
You won't get through everybody.
Thank you very much. Ursula Wee, and I'm now the chair of the Ukrainian Institute London, so thank you very much. Thank you all for your support. Some people in Ukrainian conversation now are saying Russia needs to be dismantled, taken apart, and I usually say, then, how about properly contained and perhaps disarmed? This is aspirational currently, but in your political judgment, what kind of conversation publicly, strategically, should there be around that?
Right, great question. And the gentleman also standing at the back.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I would like to ask you about what's your view on China's role in this war and whether it gets to gain or lose something from Russia's loss.
There's possibly connected, the dismantling of Russia and the expansion of China could be two parts of the same thing. We have one more question from that side, and then, yes, there's a black hand, a dark blue hand there. Is that you, Louis? Yes, it is. Hi.
Hello. I want to ask, the reason why we're here speaking about this is essentially because the Ukrainians will fight. If the Ukrainians didn't fight, we wouldn't be here speaking about this, and the Ukrainians will fight has kind of revitalized NATO and the European Union and giving them a political future that is not stagnation and irrelevance. When Ukraine will win this war and become more integrated into European architecture, do you think there will be how will that affect the balance in Europe? Will arguably the Eastern Europe and Baltic will have a strong...
Got it, absolutely, yes. I mean, I think the centre of gravity is shifting eastwards, and the most important allies in the most important countries now are Poland, despite some difficulties with the government, Kiev, Bucharest coming up fast, the Nordic Baltic areas, and the old sort of Paris, Berlin, Brussels centre of gravity, I think, has shifted. But Anne, do you want to, should we be wanting to break up Russia, and if we do, does that just hand bits of it to China?
So I didn't think we have any influence on the future of Russia in that sense, and I didn't think we should try. I didn't think there's a role for any Western country to play in any of those decisions. I should say here that I know that a lot of Ukrainians now in particular, but also Central Europeans, are so understandably angry at Russia and angry at the Russians for allowing this to happen, and even angry at the Russian opposition for allowing this to happen, that they sort of wish ill towards Russia and they wish chaos and disaster. I still wish Russia a better government. I wish Russia a government that is actually good for Russians and doesn't seek to simply doesn't exist for the glory of the leaders and some crazy idea about history or empire. And I don't want to give up that wish. So I'm not part of the conversation about how it should break up or what its borders should be.
Good. We could spend a whole hour and a half just on the future of Russia, but I do want to keep this as focused on Ukraine as possible. We're looking at the murder victim here, not at the perpetrator. More questions? Red hand. I can't see what it's attached to, but there's red sleeve.
Hi, ladies. I wanted to ask if you could just comment on the immediate results of this application to NATO and how that's going to play out in the next little while.
Okay. Let's have some more questions this side. There's a lady at the front in a check jacket.
Thank you for both of you. I was wondering why it's so difficult for the West to recognize the genocide, to call the war, Russian war in Ukraine as genocide?
Why is it so difficult for the West to call Russia's war a genocide? We have one more question.
I didn't have any difficulty with it.
The gentleman there with the beard. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'm Nicholas Beck. You mentioned how the costs are very, very high and the highest, and prolonging the war only will make it worse. Is it anything other than going nuclear that could trigger the West? And especially, you also mentioned that the fear for Russia has been way down. So the risk of other countries interfering in the war is in some way are lower than before, especially as Russia weakens. Is there anything that to shorten the period of the war can bring to the table other governments?
There was a very stupid German commentator who is highly regarded in Germany and came out with, I thought, possibly would win a prize, the stupidest thing said in the West about the war, which is even the worst peace is better than the best war. And I thought that you really have to be dramatically out of touch to say that. And it is true that there are people who say, by supplying weapons, you're just, why can't we have dialogue instead of confrontation? This is going to end in negotiation. Let's start the negotiation now. And I think all that does is to store up problems for the future. I completely agree with Anne. The only stable result for this, and it won't be particularly good because Russia will be in such a dreadful state after it loses, but the best we can hope for, I think, is a clear military defeat for Russia, and then we have to manage the aftermath, and I don't feel we have a Russia strategy yet for dealing with what comes next. For years, Ukraine was the sort of passive recipient of, will the IMF give some money? Are you going to be allowed to have this association agreement with the EU or so on? But it was always from a position of being a supplicant. And I think what the war has done is it's put Ukraine in the driving seat. Ukraine sets the agenda on things now, and when and we saw this a little bit with Boris Johnson. If you imagine how rarely a Ukrainian leader would have been able to get a phone call with the British Prime Minister until 2014, and now Ukraine is really hot. And if Zelensky chose to go abroad, which he doesn't quite rightly, but he would be addressing both houses of Congress, both houses of Parliament, just like that. Everyone in the world would want to hear what he had to say, and I don't think any East European, to use the phrase very loosely, leader since Václav Havel has had anything like that kind of clout. Does that mean you get into NATO straight away? No, I don't think so. But as Anne said, it's on the agenda. We have time for one more, or perhaps two more questions. They're very short ones. I'll take one from...
maybe from the camera operator.
The camera operator. Yes.
I wanted to ask, what do you think, what role will the rhetoric of information warfare, so the instability of facts, play in Ukrainian democracy?
Right, okay, and then we have another question. Someone has had their hand up. Yes, the chap just behind you.
So my question isn't a Russian question, it's not a Ukrainian question, it's a Belarus question. What do you see the future politically for Belarus in, say, 25, 50 years?
50 years.
Well, who knows? And the gentleman with the beard there, he's been very patient.
I was struck by you talking about a military wing and thinking that would be the good solution. I'm just wondering whether that worked to heal the country and everything.
I didn't understand that.
I don't know if that comes.
I would say Germany in 1945.
I didn't understand the question.
When did a military victory ever solve anything?
Oh, yes. No, I mean, military victories solve a lot of things. The victory in World War II solved a number of problems. You can point to that.
I'm fascinated by this question about information warfare facts and the way that will I mean, this has been a kind of road test for all sorts of Russian disinformation techniques and amazingly successful Ukrainian counter-disinformation techniques, and also what looked like amazingly successful Ukrainian information operations.
I mean, you can certainly, if you want to know, again, one of the explanations for why Zelensky has been such a good communicator is that the Ukrainians did absorb the lessons of the Russian information onslaught that they've been subjected to for the past decade. Some of the things that we've learned are quite important. We've known this for a while, but I think that there's some clarity now that what matters in convincing people of facts is not merely creating fact-checking operations or fact-checking websites. It's about creating narratives that inspire trust. So the question isn't, how do you tell the truth? I mean, of course, it's very important to tell the truth, but it's also important to how do you tell the truth in a way that builds a sense of community and understanding. And I actually do think it will be a huge challenge for Ukraine after the war. And there are a lot of open questions about how its news system will work. There's right now this kind of artificial system where all the television stations operate as a single entity, in effect, and what they will decide about how to govern their information space and how media should be run will be very challenging. I mean, I don't think anybody's really thinking in great detail about it yet. But thinking about how to have a national conversation that both allows for normal disputes, as in a democracy are normal, and at the same time creates that resilience and trust is going to be difficult. I mean, it's not something the Ukrainians have done very successfully up until now, for which you can't blame them, because I'm not sure the United States is any better. So, the question but it's a particular challenge for Ukraine because they're subjected to this onslaught of disinformation all the time.
I'll just finish up with very briefly on Belarus, that I think that on our side, speaking broadly, I think the weakest point is Moldova. And if Putin's going to get anywhere, he might get somewhere with his economic warfare against Moldova and the enormous burden on the poorest country in Europe of having to pay world prices for gas, actually stoked by countries like Germany buying up all the gas available. So but I think similarly on the other side, Putin's weakest point is Belarus. And I think trying to bring Belarus into the war could bring pressure inside Belarus to boiling point. I've heard people say if the Belarusian army was ordered to attack Ukraine, they would turn their guns right.
No, there's even more.
Yeah.
So the Belarusians who I spoke to, who are fighting with the Ukrainian army, told me they have been contacted by Belarusian officers who say, "Tell us how to surrender. If we're ordered over the border, tell us what to do." And to which one of them said, "Put down your gun and put your hands up."
If anyone here who drives a tank, if you want to surrender, turn the turret to the opposite, so the gun's pointing the opposite direction from your driving. This is kind of news you can use if you're a Russian tank commander. But I think that Belarus could turn on a dime. It's a really advanced country in many ways, and we haven't noticed really what's going on because of the political carapace of the Lukashenko regime. But I think we will see Belarus as an EU member much sooner than people might think. I'm actually quite optimistic. Good. Well, I think I hand over to the Chief of General Staff.